Hello, good evening. It's a great honor and a privilege to have a very special guest, Miriam Stein, a very dear friend, a patient of many years. And Miriam is one of the Kindertransport, and we look forward to hearing your, not only fascinating, but to hear part of Jewish history, which is so important for future generations to hear and for us to understand the trauma and the miracle that happened with the Kindertransport. So Miriam, I really appreciate this evening, and I thank you
It's my pleasure.
for your very valuable time and for agreeing to do this interview.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Miriam, I'd like to start off by asking, where were you born?
In the Rhineland in Germany, in a small town where there weren't that many Jewish people, but there was a synagogue and there was a Jewish school.
And you grew up in Germany, the Rhineland's part of Germany.
Right.
And this was in the early 30s?
Yes, I was born in 1930, and we lived there until 1930, beginning 39, 1930.
And did you come from a traditional Jewish home?
Yes. My parents were both physicians, and they were both religious. And my father was very active in the local synagogue. And we were what you would call frum.
That's religious, Orthodox religious.
Right, right.
Did they have a Jewish school that you went to?
We had a school. It was what we would call a one-room school. It was, there were, I can show you pictures of it. There were maybe 15, 18 children of all ages with one teacher, and we met in the synagogue. And I was just a little girl, so I wasn't very active in the school. But my brother, a little more so. My brother was a year older than I am.
And what was the name of the town that you grew up in?
Siegburg.
In the Rhineland.
In the Rhineland.
And was there quite a large Jewish community in this town?
I think there were about 100 Jewish families.
Was it a small village or a little...
Yes, it was a small village.
And how did the Jewish community or the Jewish population interact with the non-Jewish population?
Well, I don't know in general, but my father was a local physician, and a lot of his patients were Gentiles until there was a time when my mother worked with my father in the office, but I don't remember exactly the year, but there was a time when Hitler came to power, when Hitler said that only one person in the family can be a breadwinner. So my mother backed out, and my father continued his office practice until it was again a decree by Hitler that no Gentile people can go to a Jewish doctor. And that's when my father saw the light, and he said that he can't live that way. He can't survive with his practice. So he left. My father, at that time, you could only go to another country if you had a number and a quota system. And the quota system for Cuba was very short, so my father was able to go to Cuba at a moment's notice. And he lived there for 2 years.
What year was this, roughly?
My father left right after Kristallnacht. At that time, my father had a friend who was a priest. And the priest met him in the street one day, and he warned him that there would be a pogrom. And so my father went to Cuba in 1938, and my mother and my brother stayed in Germany.
And I just want to, before we go on, I'd like to just ask you about your recollections growing up as a small girl. Did you play with your neighbors? Do you have recollections of playing with?
I don't really have much memory of that, but we have pictures, and from the pictures, I can tell you that my parents had a very large house, and with an even larger garden in the back, and the garden was surrounded by a brick wall, and we stayed in this garden as a protection against the environment that we lived in. So my brother and I played in the garden, and except for the times that we went to the school, we didn't venture out. We didn't.
And do you still have memories of the German youth, or anything happening in your town with the Nazi Party?
My brother is a type of archivist. He's very interested in the past, and he wrote several books about it. And in one of the books, he mentioned that from the window of our bedroom, he could see the SS marching in the street. And the actual Kristallnacht was something that my mother, who was at that time alone with us, she protected us from that incident. So we really didn't know anything about that except in hindsight. And then I don't recall leaving Siegburg, but I know that my grandparents lived, my mother's parents lived in Berlin, and we went to, my mother took us to Berlin, and from there we got on a train. I have no recollection of that.
But you were pretty young. You were quite young at this age. 8 years old.
Yeah. But I was 8. I was a sheltered 8. You understand?
Yeah.
I wasn't. Nowadays, 8-year-old children are much more worldly than I was. So I didn't. I just don't remember going on the train, but I do know that we did go on the train, and from the train we went on a boat to London. And we had relatives in London, and my mother was under the impression that these relatives would take us in.
Did your mother go on the train and the boats as well?
No, only the children.
And she stayed behind in Berlin?
She stayed behind because her parents were very elderly. They lived in Berlin, and she stayed with them. But before that, my mother packed up our house. She packed a lift, actually 2 lifts, with everything that she could possibly buy, and all our belongings, everything that was in our house, came on the lift, and it was brought to America and put in storage. And so my mother was able to sell the house. Actually, the city of Siegburg bought the house, and they made it into a headquarters for the SS.
Wow, that's...
And then later on, it became a museum. The house became a museum, and just going in every which way direction.
Okay, can I just ask, just before we, because it's very fascinating about the train and going on the Kindertransport, for our listeners who might not understand, Kristallnacht means the night of broken glass, where the synagogues were decimated, they were destroyed. Was the synagogue in your town also destroyed?
Oh yes.
It was. So it was right throughout Germany and Austria.
Yes. It was totally destroyed, but one of the Jewish people was able to crawl through a hole and save a Sefer Torah, and that Sefer Torah came here to Israel. Yeah.
Do you have any?
It wasn't just the synagogues.
It was the shops and the homes as well.
What they did was the SS drove through the streets with a, I guess it was an iron rod, and as they drove down the street, they just destroyed all the windows of the shops. And so it was broken glass wherever you turn.
And do you have any memories from that night? That terrible...
No, I really
think your
don't.
mother must have sheltered you and your brother.
Very much so. Very much so. My mother was a very brave lady. She really, she did a Herculean job with raising us in a way that was not harmful to us.
And Miriam, how long did you stay in Berlin when you came from your town and you went to your grandparents?
It was just a few days. We didn't stay in Berlin.
It was en route?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a very hard question, and please forgive me, but...
Don't worry.
When you went on that train from Berlin and then onto the ship, and you had to say goodbye to your mother, do you recall?
No. I don't remember a thing. I was too young. And I have Ad Hayom, I have a tendency to not remember bad things. I try to remember good things, and I have no memory of that. And my brother, who has a fantastic memory, also doesn't remember being on the train and saying goodbye to my mother.
Is it possible your mother could have, maybe as being a doctor and having such medical knowledge, possibly have, to lessen the trauma, sedated a little bit, that you...
I have no idea. I really don't. I think it was too horrendous for us to cope with. So we went along with whatever, somebody said go here, we went there, and that was it.
It must have been incredibly difficult for your mother to send you on the train,
Absolutely.
not knowing if she was ever going to see you again.
Right.
Okay, now this is maybe even a harder question to ask. Did you ever see your mother again?
Of course.
Well, thank God. Okay, so that, at least this has a happy
What
end.
my mother did was she, after she had packed our things into a lift, actually two very big lifts, she packed up my grandparents. And she was able to, at that time, you couldn't take money out of Germany. You could only take things.
It was very difficult to get out of Germany, period.
Yeah, I don't know how she managed that, but she took her parents and went to London, and she lived in London in a very little apartment. It was actually above a church, and my grandfather was a Rav with a long beard, so it was a little bit incongruous. But they lived in a very small apartment, and my grandparents were old and sick, and my mother took care of them. And my mother thought that our relatives, we had an aunt and uncle, and the aunt had several brothers and sisters who were already established in London. but they didn't take us in, and I don't know why.
And they knew you were coming? They knew you were part of the Kindertransport?
As a matter of fact, one of my aunt's sisters was on the reception committee when we landed in London, and she didn't take us. And my brother and I went to an orphanage in London with all the other children.
And this was it wasn't a specific Jewish orphanage?
Yes, yes it was.
It was a Jewish orphanage?
My brother's a very frum man, and he...
It's a religious,
and at that
religious
time,
Orthodox?
Yeah, religious. And at that time, even when... So he was only 10 years old, but he always complained that... He said they didn't have Shabbos toilet paper, and they didn't... But it was a kosher home.
And how long did you stay in the orphanage?
We were there until the London Blitz came. The London Blitz was when Germany began, the war had started, and Hitler, he just bombed London to pieces. And the government in England decided that any child who could would leave London.
And go into the countryside?
Right. My brother, then they separated the girls from the boys. So my brother and I were separated. He went to a place called Margate, which was in the seashore, and he lived in a boys' home, like an orphanage. And I went up north to a family in rather a remote part of England, where there were people who were willing to take us in.
And these were non-Jewish people?
Yes. And not only non-Jewish, they didn't even know a Jew existed. It was,
They did it from the kindness of their heart?
Yes, yes. And a little girl who became a friend of mine from the orphanage, and I went to a family. Their name was King, Mr. and Mrs. King. They were elderly people. They had no children, and they were very happy to have us. And we lived with them for about 2 years, and we ate in a communal, like a moadon,
communal kitchen?
Yeah, kosher kitchen. And the Kings loved us. We became like their children.
And you being Jewish was not an issue?
They didn't understand. They didn't understand Jewishness. So just as an example, my mother, who was at that time already in London, sent me a coat with a note saying that this is a new Shabbos coat. And Mrs. King, I guess she understood Shabbat, and she thought Shabbat was Sunday. So she put the coat on for me on Sunday, and I said, no, it's not our Shabbat, it's your Saturday is, and it was difficult because we didn't speak much English at that time. We didn't learn English when we were children. So there was a lot of love between the Kings and us, so that we got by. We got by.
And during this time, did you manage to see your mother?
No, but we wrote to each other. We didn't see her. No, we didn't see her.
When you came to England on the Kindertransport, and when your mother came, how long was the interval till you first saw her?
I guess it was about 1.5 years.
Was it just virtually very difficult for her to find you, or to...
We were in the north of London. My mother was busy with her parents who were sick. In the meantime, my grandfather had died and she was in Shiva. It
was the war years as well.
You know, there are many questions that I have today that unfortunately my mother isn't with us anymore that I could ask her. But there are many things that I don't understand even today. You know, how things happen. But our story was that my father was able to get a visa to go to America.
From Cuba?
From Cuba. And once he was in America, he was able to send for us. So my mother came to Stotfold, which was the village where I lived, and she picked me up.
Okay, and how many years were you already in England when your mother picked you up? Was it still during the war?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, it was during the war.
Okay, Miriam, I'm going to ask you, I'm sorry I'm asking you all these,
No,
but
no.
It's just, you know, this is living history. This is your living history. When you met your mother, when she came to bed, it must have been exceptionally emotional. Here you hadn't seen your mother for such a long time. Can you describe your feelings, or is it too personal or too difficult?
It's not too difficult. I just don't remember. I don't remember the details of that. Of course, I can only imagine that we were just overjoyed to be together again, and with my brother as well, because I hadn't seen my brother this whole time.
For a lot of months, for many months.
Well, it was about a year and a half.
And you hadn't seen your brother. Were you in touch via mail or?
With my mother,
Telegrams?
yes. My brother, I don't recall. I don't recall writing to him. It was hard because we were still in the German language mode. You know, it was even though this communal dining room also became a quasi-school for us. So they taught us a little bit of arithmetic and whatnot, but primarily they taught us English so that we would be able to communicate better with our environment. But I don't know, I don't remember a lot of it.
Okay, and
I really don't.
I hope this might be the last of the difficult questions. Your family that you had in England at the time, did they come and visit you? Your extended family?
The Christian family?
No, your extended biological family that was living in England. Your relatives, did they...
Oh, we're very close with them.
No, when you were a little girl at this moment, when you were in the north of England, or did they visit your brother when he was in Margate?
No. You understand, it was a difficult time. London was being bombed and people had their own sorrows, their own
difficulties.
And we didn't see any of them.
You must have a lot of questions. How come your own relatives didn't take you and your brother in? It's a very difficult... We aren't to judge. We can't judge, and we don't... it's not our place to judge.
I just don't know. It wasn't only our relatives.
It's a lot of children.
But a lot of people complained that the English Jews did not take in the children. Very few of them did. And I suppose that everybody had their own problems and didn't work out that way. But I must say that living with a Christian family didn't do me any harm. They were kind to me, and they were like my parents for the time that I was there. And I just don't remember suffering under in their house. You know, it was...
and they didn't get financial gain. They did it from the goodness of their heart. I
don't know.
Yeah.
I never thought of that.
But it was a big thing to take in total strangers.
I suspect that they did get paid.
Maybe they got a bit of help, but to do what they did was remarkable.
Absolutely.
It's really opening their homes to total strangers from a different religion and giving shelter.
What happened when we were in the London orphanage, and we were told that we would be leaving the next day. I was one of the youngest children there, one of the youngest of the kids. And there was some that I knew, that I remember, because we saw them when we came to America, who were already 17, 18 years old. And they took care of us. And I remember the day that we were to leave, we all had to take a bath and have our hair washed and our nails clipped, and so that we should be, decent, for the people that we were going to. And I remember when we got to Stotfold, my friend and I were given to a family that were cruel, cruel people. And there are very few things that I remember, but I do remember that when we got there, she was worried that we had lice or fleas or something or other. So she put us into a bathtub with water that she had used to clean the floor.
Oy.
It was black water. And we just stood in the tub. We refused to sit down, and we were just horrified. And we complained the next morning. We complained to the staff of the dining hall, and they took us out of there right away and brought us to the family that we finally stayed with.
Wow.
So, some of the things were not so good, but mostly it was okay for me. It really was, except for the fact that, of course, I missed my parents. And so then when my father was able to go to America, then he sent for us.
But it was still very dangerous to go from England to America during
We went, and at that time, nobody flew. You didn't even know that airplanes carried passengers. So we went in a boat, and the boat was the boat was part of a convoy of battleships, and there was in each corner of the boat that we were on, the ship that we were on, there was another ship on the corner protecting us. And it was in the winter. It was in February, and we were terribly sick, terribly seasick. And we didn't land in America, we landed in Nova Scotia.
It's part of Canada.
In Canada. And everything was snowy and icy, and it was terrible. And from there we took a train to Brooklyn, New York. And then my father met us at the pier.
Do you remember the meeting with your father?
Yes, I do.
That must have been exceptionally emotional.
That was really, really something. I remember my father the tears were streaming down his face when he saw us. And then it wasn't so simple after that, because my father was studying for his medical boards in America.
He had to kind of re-qualify. Not re-qualify, but he had to write the boards.
Right. And so he was... he earned a little money, but he used to be a night nurse for people who were ill. And my mother also. But essentially we didn't have any money because we couldn't take any money out. And so it was hard times. I remember eating day-old bread. And when we had to go someplace, we couldn't take the trolley car or whatever because it cost 3 pennies. It was a hard time.
And this is still in the middle of the Second World War.
Well, by that time, America came into the war. Because America came in the end of
It was after Pearl Harbor.
1941, yeah.
Were you aware when you were on that on the ship going from England to Nova Scotia that there were U-boats, that there were torpedoes, and that was a dangerous, very dangerous
it was dangerous
journey?
That's why we had this convoy who went on the sea with us
To protect.
to protect us. But it was a liner. It was a passenger liner.
And were there other refugees on that boat?
I suspect. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Tell you the truth, we had a cabin, and my brother, he's a real starker. But my mother and I spent most of the time in the cabin. We didn't venture out because we were seasick. Because it wasn't, you don't travel the seas in February. It's not a good time.
Well, thank God you arrived safely, and
Thank God.
and you started a new life in America.
Very much so.
And how did that differ from England? Or were you accepted with the American kids? Did they? Was it difficult making new friends?
It was difficult because, there's an expression, the new guy on the block. So we were the new kids, and we had our clothes were different because my mother had packed our clothes from Germany, and we were not in the height of fashion in Brooklyn. We stood out, so to speak. And but by that time our language was pretty good. So, but I remember we arrived in Brooklyn in February, and we didn't go to school until September. I don't know exactly why. So at that time, I don't know if it's still today, but children had to be in school. It was a law that children had to be in school. And since we weren't in school, we couldn't go out during school hours because there were truant officers.
Really?
Who would, put my mother in jail.
Wow.
If we weren't in school. So we more or less stayed put until the summer when nobody was in school. And it was hard. It was hard. And when we did go to school, we weren't we really weren't qualified to be in the grade according to our age.
You had missed so much of the education.
So we were. It took a while for us to catch up.
And can I ask, did you speak to your new friends, telling them that you came from Germany and what was happening in Europe? Were the other kids interested in this, or was it difficult to speak to them about it, or they didn't want to know?
No, nobody cared. Nobody cared.
Not even within the Jewish community?
Well, within the Jewish community, we were all in the same boat. A lot of us were refugees in Germany.
But speaking to the wider community, nobody really...
Not that I know of. I don't think so.
So that's very difficult. It
was difficult, but we survived.
And you lived in New York for many years?
Until we made Aliyah.
You met your husband in New York?
Yes, in Brooklyn. Yeah. And it was, we had a little man, we called him Moshe, but his name wasn't really Moshe. He had a fruit and vegetable store, and my mother used to send me there to go shopping. And he had this Moshe had a friend who he sat next to in shul, who had a son who was in medical school. And so Moshe said, you know, somebody comes into my shop and she's a doctor's daughter and you have a son who's a medical student, maybe we could make a shidduch here. And he did.
And that's how you met your husband?
That's how I met him. Yeah.
Wow. And Miriam, what did you do after school? Did you go to college or?
Yeah, I went to Brooklyn. I graduated from Brooklyn College.
What did you graduate in?
Classical languages, Latin and Greek.
Wow.
But my father was very upset about that. He said, what are you going to do with Latin and Greek? So I went to, there was a Jewish hospital in Brooklyn, and I went there to study medical laboratory technician, to be a laboratory technician. And that's what I became.
And your husband was a medical practitioner?
Yes. And my son, then we have 3 children, the oldest of which is a physician, and we have a grandson who's a physician.
Wow. So it runs in the family.
It
wow.
sure does.
And when did you make Aliyah? When did you come to Israel?
95. We came here in 1994 for a pilot trip. We stayed for 3 months. And then we went back and we packed up our house. And we came here in 1995 to this apartment.
And you always felt a desire to come to Israel?
Well, we did, but the point was by then all 3 of our children were here. Our daughter came here right after her wedding, and a few years later one son came, and then a few years later another son came. So, you know, we were there was no question that we would come here.
It's wonderful.
So, and now with my daughter, our daughter lives here in Ramot with her husband, and she has 4 children. Our oldest son lives in the Shomron, and he's head of bone marrow transplant.
Wow.
He's a pediatric oncologist. Takes care of children with cancer.
That's amazing.
And he's made quite an international name for himself. And our youngest son is a lawyer. He's a partner in a law firm in Tel Aviv. And he also has 4 children.
So you are a very proud...
And we have lots of grandchildren and many, many, many great-grandchildren.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. And when we came here, we made friends right away because, especially here in Wolfson, it's a very Anglo community. And from South Africa, from Australia, and from England, and from America, people come here. They live here in the Wolfson buildings, and we felt right at home.
And Miriam, I want to ask you, have you been to, because I know they have had periodically Kindertransport reunions?
I haven't been, no.
Would you be interested to, when they have the next one, to...
I went once actually to where there was like a reunion in the Yarkon Park in Tel Aviv, and I felt a little bit strange because I didn't know anybody. I never went back for another reunion. Maybe I should, but there aren't too many of us still around.
Well,
you know?
We just wish you a healthy and a mazel tov, and really just you should live at Mayveh Street till 120 plus VAT, that's it. But of health and happiness which you so deserve. I mean, you really went through such a... There's no words to describe. You really went through so much in your life, and you deserve such happiness.
I did, but you know, it's like, it's sort of like it rolls off my back. I don't dwell on it, and I don't think, maybe you can ask David, but I don't think it has affected me adversely, has it?
You're always a very positive, and from the very first time I ever met you, you're always smiling and positive, and it's wonderful.
My cup is always full.
That's lovely. Instead of looking at the half empty, you look at the half full. But it's wonderful, and you know, I think you owe a lot to your parents, and especially to your mother, to put you on that train. Must have been
no question
such an enormously difficult decision.
Absolutely.
Not knowing where your son and daughter's going to go. It was a very unselfish thing to do, but she had the foresight to see what was best for her children, and no one should be put in that position, but she did the right choice, and thank God it really was the right choice, and it saved your lives.
She was a very strong lady, and she never took, when my father took his state boards to get his license, medical license in America, my mother didn't. But 20 years later, she did.
Wow.
Yeah, and then she worked as a dermatologist. Yeah. She was quite something.
Please God, you should just have good health, which you so deserve. And I really want to thank you so much for sharing your very special life experience, your life story, and you're such an example for all of us to really emulate. Really, the joy and the happiness that you show and that you live by, and it's wonderful. It really is, and just health, happiness, and only Hashem's blessings, God's blessings. Thank you very much.
Okay, my pleasure. This is a picture of my mother, and the book contains a diary, a translation of the diary that my mother kept from the time that my brother was born in 1929 until we came to America. And my brother was able to translate the German into English, and that's what this book is about.
You can see a very courageous lady, your mother.
Yes, she was dignified and very smart. She was the daughter of a rabbi, a religious woman who was accepted in medical school at a time when women didn't go to medical school. So she was really
a German
exceptional lady. This is a book that my brother, who also lives here in Jerusalem, wrote about our childhood in Siegburg. That was the name of the town. And this is, he was born in 1929.
To 1938.
And this is a picture of our school, the Jewish school that we had. You see that there's only one teacher, and children of all ages in the same classroom.
And circled is your brother?
Circled is my brother. And here at the bottom, this is me. I was always the smallest, the youngest and the smallest.
So you were the youngest in the school? Well, thank God there's photographs and there's memories.
Yes, yeah, we have a lot of, oh, that's the picture of my mother.
This is my mother-in-law, Miriam's mother.